This one's going to be a bit of a big one because I'm going to talk about grief and what I've learned through the process of grieving. There are things I didn't know that I do now, and for anybody who maybe is starting that process or is in what they class anticipatory grief, where you know it's coming. These are some of the things that I've learned. So I hope it's helpful for someone. Okay, so the idea of the video was 5 things I've learned in the grieving process. The first thing is you're not going to be able to escape grief. And all the running, cycling, walking, hiking, reading, whatever you're doing to try and escape it, you can't. It's there. You can't shelve it and come back to it later, because as you do things, suddenly a thought or a memory will hit you and you're right back at the beginning again. So you can try as you might to block it out, but it's impossible to do that. That's not to say that there isn't value in doing those things, because there absolutely is. They actually, in some ways, I think help with the process. And I'm not saying you have to go out and be sporty. Just doing something that you enjoy doing, or that challenges you, perhaps, can help take your head out of it a little bit. Not for long, but it can add a bit of a distraction. I find that doing certain things actually makes me feel a bit closer to her. So, walking in the mountains, kayaking, just walking, beach days, all that sort of stuff that she liked, and I'm sure quite a lot of people like those sorts of things. So doing those sorts of things can actually make you feel closer to the person that's gone. Songs, certain songs. There are songs I've listened to that I used to listen to as a child, and like I used to know the lyrics to some, and since this has happened, those lyrics have suddenly turned into something quite different from what I'd originally used to think the song was about. It's given me a different perspective, if you like. So I found that when I'm listening to music, if I'm running, I can be going along and doing all right, and then the song will come on and I listen to the lyrics, and then suddenly it just hits me. And these are songs that never ever had an impact in that way before. And I realised that, like, sometimes, because I do tend to listen to lyrics as well as the music, and I think this goes back to when I was very young. Music was a way of escaping things, and I used to just sit and write out what I thought were the lyrics to songs. And so some of those songs now, when I hear them, like, it takes your breath away. It's also conversations that take place, not necessarily from people that you know. It might just be something you're walking down the street and you hear a conversation between people. It can be anything. So, whilst you can't escape it, I think focusing on doing things that you do enjoy, I guess learning not to feel guilty about doing those things, is a good place to start. Aside from anything else, if you're getting out and you're doing something, then you're at least getting fresh air, a bit of sunshine, and maybe, I don't know, improving your health in other ways. The second lesson, if you're going through anticipatory grief, so where you know that the person is not going to be there for long, sometimes when you're in that space, you feel like you are already grieving. And I guess in some ways you almost feel like it might be easier after, because you've done a lot of it. You've considered what your life might look like without them. And in some ways you've kind of come to an acceptance that it's going to happen and that you will have to deal with it. You will have to live on without that person being there. But, and this is a big but, it doesn't matter how long that process is. You will not have completed the grieving. And it actually doesn't make the process any easier afterwards. You might have some belief that because you're sitting in a very difficult position, perhaps for months, even years, it may somehow make it a bit easier afterwards. And I did think that. And I was wrong. Because when you think you've started the grieving process, you have. But you then start it again, is how it feels. It's almost like you forget that there's been a build-up. It's almost right, you start from here. Lesson 3. Your experience of grief is unique. There are models of grief or stages of grief that have been well documented. They're very helpful in a lot of ways. But the important thing to remember is your experience of grief is going to depend on you, your current situation, the relationship that you had with that person and the history that you've got together. And not only that, whether you've lost a child, a partner, a sibling, or a parent, your experience of losing that person can be vastly different to somebody else's. You can take two people who've both lost a sibling, and whilst it would appear that the experiences are the same, the experience of loss, there can be an almighty chasm between the two experiences, because your experience of loss is coloured by what your relationship with that person was and what your history was together, where you fit in the family, you know, if you're the oldest or you're the youngest, or if there was stuff going on in your childhood that you were both privy to. All of these things will colour how you experience grief, which is why it's not easy when somebody says to you, I know exactly how you feel. Because you can't. You might have a sense of some of the things that person's going through, but to say you know everything that person's going through, you couldn't. Lesson 4. You can't assume that your previous experiences of grief are going to mirror the stuff that's coming your way now. And this again is quite similar to the grief you feel for the person. I think is almost determined by who you were together, what you were to each other, the lives you lived, the experiences you had, the family dynamics, and all of that. And sometimes, if you've been through difficult times, with one person who has subsequently died, and felt that you didn't feel the grief in the way you thought you might beforehand. Maybe because of a difficult relationship that you had with them. So you may have grieved for, say, a family member before. I think it's sometimes easy to assume that when you lose another family member, losing another one's going to be the same. But it really wasn't, and it isn't. And that's been quite tough to get my head around. That those two losses were not the same. And this one definitely cut deeper. Lesson 4. Going back to the Kubler-Ross model of the stages of grief, we talk about the difficulty with somebody saying, "Oh, I understand your grief because I've been through the same thing." Because the problem you have is when you do lose that person, the loss is a hole in the shape of that person, which is why it's difficult to try and compare the grief two different people might feel, because that person held space in your life that was unique to them and unique to you and your relationship with them. And so losing them, your experience of that is going to be very different to everybody else's, because whatever they were to you, they weren't that to somebody else. And likewise, the things that they were for other people, they weren't for you. And I think the dynamics come into that again. You know, there are things that you knew about them, that they knew about you, that nobody else knew. There are things that you could say to that person and they could say to you, and that you can't say to somebody else. You can't just go and have that conversation with someone else, because there was an understanding, a shared understanding of your experience of life, perhaps, of growing up. Memories that nobody else has. Memories that you have that involve them, and you can't discuss them anymore. Lesson 5. Don't put a time scale on your grief. Because you might be disappointed. If you've set yourself a bit of a time scale and you're thinking, I'll get to that stage by then, or I'll start moving out of this by this point, that's a lot of pressure. And it's quite easy to think like that in the beginning, that you'll give yourself a certain amount of time to process everything, but you might run over. And then when Kubler-Ross talk about stages of grief, is also an understanding that, well, you're not going to just necessarily move from one to the next and go through the process that way. Sometimes you might get to 4 and then suddenly go back to 2. It's not a linear process. A lot of it is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It just goes like that. And I think it's helpful to be prepared for that, so that you don't start then putting pressure on yourself, because you're not pushing through it in the way that you'd hoped or that you'd anticipated you might. It's just normal. It's life. You will get through the process, but there's no time frame for that. It will be when it will be. So now, many months on, I still quite regularly have moments that, on reading the book, you would say, well, that's stage 1 stuff. Still moments where I have to try and remember that she's not there. Even now, I still get times where I have to remember and remind myself I can't pick the phone up and talk to her. Remembering I'm not going to hear her voice anymore. I can't call her. Can't go for days out. Can't discuss politics over a couple of bottles of wine. Lesson 6. If you are in the fortunate position to still have that person with you, if there is anything that you feel like they need to hear, use the time you've got with them to tell them, to share it. Because you'll be left wishing you'd said something that maybe needed saying, and the moment's gone, and now you can't do it. Lesson 7, having the belief that your previous experiences of grief were kind of at the top end, that you felt nothing was going to touch that. Don't underestimate how hard subsequent grief periods are going to be, because going through some of the worst experiences of grief doesn't then give you a cushion for the next time it hits. It's still going to hurt. It might be a different hurt, but it's going to hurt. But I think the hurt and the pain that you feel is a reflection of what they meant to you. And so maybe in 6 months' time I'll have learnt more. I'll have more lessons. Ideally, you want to be in a position where you're feeling much better about things. And it'll happen. You just need to give yourself the time and not feel that it's got to be rushed, or because somebody else seems to have pushed through it a lot quicker. It doesn't necessarily mean it's right for you. It's like I was saying, depends on what the relationship was between them. It's all right when you hear them sound like they're a little bit further along from you to go, like, you know, I'm just not there yet. I wish I was, but I'm not. And take the pressure off. Like I said, it's not a linear process, but there will be an overall trajectory that you will move along in time towards a place where you feel much better. I think you just have to accept that. You're not going to fly through this process. But you will get there.